You realize, of course, my stepmother's voice was a sliver of ice in the warm, cloying air of the ballroom, that the only wager left to make on Elara is how long it takes for the dust to claim her. She is a creature of corners and shadows. She will marry a moth, if she is lucky, and live a life the color of dishwater. I heard the ripple of cruel, muffled laughter from her companions, and I pressed myself deeper into the alcove, the waxy leaves of a monstrous potted fern brushing against my cheek like cold, dead fingers. My own family had bet I would die alone, and it was a wager I felt certain they would win. I was a ghost at the feast of my own life. My presence in our household was an architectural oversight, a poorly placed room that everyone had learned to navigate around. My father, Lord Ashworth, a man whose spine had long ago dissolved in the acid of my stepmother's ambition, rarely met my eyes. He saw in me the ghost of his first wife, my mother, a woman of quiet intellect and gentle spirit whose memory Beatrice worked tirelessly to plaster over with layers of guilt and social triumph. My stepsister, Rosalind, was Beatrice's masterpiece. She was all sunlight and gold, her laughter a cascade of silver bells that drew every eye, every smile, every ounce of affection in a room. She was not cruel, not intentionally. She was simply oblivious, a planet so bright she was unaware of the smaller, dimmer moons that drifted in her orbit. I was the dimmest moon of all, caught in the gravity of a world that did not want me. Tonight was the annual Hartfield Ball, the glittering apex of the season, and Beatrice had orchestrated my humiliation with the precision of a master strategist. She had chosen my gown herself, a drab gray silk that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, while Rosalind shimmered in a confection of cream and gold lace. I was dressed in the color of invisibility. And then, the final stroke, this alcove. "Dear Elara, you dislike crowd so," she had said, her voice dripping with false sympathy as she steered me toward the forgotten corner. "Here, you can observe without being overwhelmed." Behind this lovely fern, she had positioned me as one might position a disused piece of furniture, a thing to be hidden from the discerning eyes of her guests. I was trapped, a specimen of social failure pinned behind glass for her private amusement. So I stood breathing in the scent of wilting blossoms and floor wax, a silent witness to a life from which I was completely excluded. Then the music faltered. A hush, sudden and profound, fell over the glittering assembly. It was a silence so complete it felt like a physical presence, a collective intake of breath that pulled the very air from the room. I peered through the fronds of my leafy prison. The great double doors of the ballroom stood open, and framed within them was a figure who seemed to have drawn all the light and sound in the world into himself. He was tall, impossibly so, and dressed in severe, immaculate black that made the colorful silks and satins of the other men look frivolous. His face was a study in harsh, beautiful lines, his expression unreadable, his eyes dark and assessing. It was the Duke of Blackwood, Alistair Vaughan. A man spoken of only in whispers, a creature of myth who possessed half the country and none of its bonhomie. He was a recluse, a specter who had not attended a social event in a decade, and he had arrived. The whispers began, a frantic rustling like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Why was he here? What did it mean? The hostess, Lady Hartfield, looked as if she might faint from either terror or ecstasy. Beatrice's hand flew to her pearls, her eyes wide with frantic calculation. Here was the greatest prize in all of England. A man of such immense wealth and power that he could rewrite the social map with a single nod. And he was here, in her sphere of influence. I saw the look she shot toward Rosalind, a silent, urgent command. "Shine, dazzle him. This is your moment." Rosalind, to her credit, simply looked bewildered, her perfect smile faltering for the first time all evening. The Duke ignored the hostess's flustered greeting. He ignored the hopeful, simpering faces turned toward him. His gaze swept the room once, a slow, deliberate survey that missed nothing. It was not the gaze of a man looking for a dance partner. It was the gaze of an architect inspecting a structure for its flaws. His eyes passed over the glittering chandeliers, the straining musicians, a sea of hopeful debutantes. They passed over Rosalind's golden beauty without a flicker of interest. And then, they stopped. They found my corner. They found my fern. They found me. For a heart-stopping moment, I was certain he was looking at something behind me, a tapestry or a piece of statuary. It was impossible. I was not meant to be seen. But his eyes, dark and shockingly direct, remained fixed on my position. The world seemed to shrink until it contained only the two of us, separated by a chasm of polished floor and breathless bodies. He took a step, then another. The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea, a path clearing as if by divine intervention. He walked with a quiet, unhurried purpose, his destination clear. He was walking directly toward me. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the numb resignation in my chest. This was a mistake, a joke. Perhaps Beatrice had paid him to complete my humiliation on a grander scale. I wanted to shrink, to melt into the damask wallpaper, to become nothing more than a shadow. He stopped just before the alcove, his height casting me into a sudden profound darkness. He did not look down at me with pity or amusement. He looked at me as if I were a puzzle he was considering. And then he spoke, his voice low and resonant, cutting through the suffocating silence of the room. "The fan vaulting in this ceiling," he said, his gaze lifting for a moment to the ornate plasterwork above us, "is a rather poor imitation of the perpendicular Gothic style. Do you not agree, Miss Ashworth?" He knew my name. The Duke of Blackwood. A man who supposedly knew no one knew my name. I could not breathe. My throat was a knot of raw fear. I could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes boring into my back, could feel my stepmother's fury radiating across the room like heat from a furnace. I could only manage a single shaky nod. "I thought so," he said, and the corner of his mouth tilted in something that was not quite a smile, but was a universe away from a frown. "The load-bearing ribs are purely decorative. An honest structure does not need to pretend." He looked back at me, his eyes holding mine. "It is a room built on a lie." And with that, he offered me his arm. It was a gesture of such impossible world-altering significance that for a moment I did not understand it, but his arm remained steady and patient, a silent invitation to step out of the shadows. Trembling, I placed my hand on the fine black wool of his sleeve, and allowed the Duke of Blackwood to lead me out of my prison and into the blinding, terrified heart of the ballroom. The days that followed were a fever dream of confusion and whispered speculation. Beatrice was a storm cloud confined to the drawing room, her fury all the more potent for being suppressed. She could not rage at me openly, not when the most powerful man in England had singled me out, but her displeasure poisoned the air, seeping into the walls and under the doors. She questioned me relentlessly. "What did he say? Why did he speak to you? What trick did you use to garner his attention?" She could not comprehend it. In her world, value was measured in beauty, dowry, and social grace. I possessed none of these things. My existence in the Duke's eyes was an error in her perfectly calculated arithmetic. I had no answers for her, for I had no answers for myself. The Duke had escorted me to a quiet terrace, procured a glass of lemonade from my trembling hands, and spoken to me for 10 minutes about the structural merits of various London townhouses before returning me to the edge of the ballroom and departing as abruptly as he had arrived. It was bizarre, inexplicable. I spent my nights staring at my ceiling, replaying his words. An honest structure does not need to pretend. Was he speaking of the ceiling or of something else? Of someone else? I was terrified to hope. Hope was a dangerous, fragile thing, and my heart had been taught to crush it on sight, like a spider in a teacup. I concluded it must have been a whim, a moment of ducal eccentricity. He had seen a lonely girl and performed a random act of kindness, or perhaps cruelty. I would never see him again, and it was better that way. Hope could not be broken if it was never allowed to bloom. A week later, a footman in the severe black and silver livery of the Blackwood estate arrived at our door. He bore a single, heavy cream envelope addressed to me. My hand shook so violently I could barely break the wax seal, which bore the impression of a wolf's head. Inside, a short, formal note in a strong masculine hand invited me to Blackwood House in London the following afternoon to view a collection of architectural folios he thought might be of interest to me. It was signed simply, Blackwood. Beatrice snatched the note from my hand. Her eyes scanned the words, her face a mask of disbelief that slowly hardened into suspicion. "What is this about?" she hissed, her fingers tightening on the expensive paper. "Architectural folios? Do not play the fool with me, Elara. What is his game?" "I do not know," I whispered, and it was the honest truth. "I have no idea." "You will go, of course," she said, her mind already racing, calculating the angles. "Rosalind will accompany you. It is not proper for you to go alone." Her intent was clear. If the Duke was, for some insane reason, interested in the drab sparrow, she would ensure he was reminded of the magnificent bird of paradise waiting in the wings. Blackwood House was not a house. It was a fortress of pale stone and dark glass that loomed over the square, seeming to consume the very sunlight. It was severe, elegant, and utterly intimidating. A stern butler led us not to a frivolous drawing room, but to a library that stole the breath from my lungs. It was a cathedral of books, 2 stories of floor-to-ceiling shelves, connected by a delicate spiral staircase of black iron. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and beeswax. A fire crackled in a cavernous marble hearth, and standing before it, silhouetted against the flames, was the Duke. He turned as we entered, and his eyes, for a brief, dismissive moment, flickered over Rosalind's radiant form before settling on me. He gave a slight, formal bow. "Miss Ashworth, thank you for coming." Miss Rosalind, who could charm a statue into conversation, seemed at a loss. She curtsied, murmuring a polite greeting, but the Duke's attention had already returned to me. "I believe this is what I wanted to show you," he said, leading me toward a massive oak table, where a colossal leather-bound book lay open. He gestured for Rosalind to take a seat by the fire, a polite but firm dismissal that left her stranded on an island of chintz upholstery while he drew me into his world. The folio was filled with original drawings by Andrea Palladio, the lines of ink precise and perfect, the designs a symphony of proportion and harmony. I forgot my fear. I forgot Rosalind and Beatrice, and the entire, suffocating world outside this room. I traced the lines of a villa with my finger, my mind alive with the pure, clean logic of the design. "The harmony," I breathed, forgetting to be shy. "It is mathematical." He understood that beauty is not an ornament, but a result of perfect structure. The Duke was watching me, his expression intense. "Precisely," he said, his voice quiet. "Most people see only the columns and the friezes. They do not see the thought, the integrity of the framework beneath." He paused, then looked at me directly. "Do you know why I invited you here, Miss Ashworth?" I shook my head, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs. Here it was, the explanation, the punchline to the joke. 3 years ago, he began, his voice low, at the Dashwood Musicale, a new conservatory had been built, a monstrosity of glass and iron that everyone was fawning over. I was standing near an archway, and I overheard a young woman, you, speaking quietly to your father. You said, "The design is ambitious, but the lateral bracing is insufficient. In a heavy snow, the sheer weight will cause the roof to buckle inward." You said it was beautiful, but dishonest. I stared at him, my mind reeling back. I remembered that night. I remembered the conservatory, a glittering bauble I knew was fundamentally flawed. Prandy. I had whispered my concern to my father, who had hushed me immediately, telling me not to speak of such things. "I am a student of architecture," the Duke continued. "A grim hobby, perhaps, but a consuming one. Your observation was not only correct, it was brilliant, perceptive. I asked who you were, and I remembered your name." He looked at me, and for the first time I saw something beyond his severe, guarded expression. I saw a flicker of profound loneliness of a mind starved for an equal. Last winter, during a particularly heavy snowfall, the roof of the Dashwood Conservatory buckled inward, just as you predicted. I was speechless. He had not seen a plain, awkward girl in a corner. He had not seen a social failure. He had heard me. All this time, when I thought my words were dissolving into the air like smoke, He had heard me. He had listened, and he had remembered. "I find," he said, his gaze returning to the Palladian drawings, "that I have little time for things that are not honest, buildings or people." He turned a page, revealing a breathtaking design for a rotunda. "I hoped you might consent to discuss these drawings with me. I find my own thoughts on the matter have grown stale." Rosalind sat by the fire, forgotten. My stepmother's schemes were a world away. In that moment, in that quiet, magnificent library, a small, terrified seed of hope, the one I had tried so hard to kill, began to unfurl a single tentative leaf in the barren soil of my heart. I was afraid it would be crushed. But as I looked at the Duke, at the genuine intellectual curiosity in his eyes, I was more afraid that for the first time in my life it might actually be allowed to grow. Our meetings in his library became my sanctuary. Twice a week I would escape my gilded cage and enter his world of quiet thought and structural integrity. Rosalind's chaperonage quickly became a formality. She would bring a novel, settle into a comfortable armchair by the fire, and leave us to our blueprints and our debates. She seemed relieved in a way. The Duke's intensity was not for her, and she saw with her simple, uncomplicated kindness that it was for me. She saw that in his presence I unfurled. The hesitant, stammering girl she knew at home was replaced by someone who could argue passionately about the merits of a flying buttress or the elegant efficiency of a Roman aqueduct. With him, my voice felt steady. My thoughts, which had always swirled chaotically in the silence of my own mind, found order and expression. We spoke a shared language. We would spend hours bent over massive sheets of vellum, discussing the interplay of light and shadow in a cathedral nave, the precise geometry of a dome, the soul of a building. He did not treat me like a woman to be charmed or flattered. He treated me like a mind to be engaged. He would challenge my assertions, forcing me to defend my reasoning, and a slow, brilliant smile would touch his lips when I made a point that successfully countered his own. These were not romantic interludes. Not in the conventional sense. There were no whispered sweet nothings, no coy glances. The intimacy we built was forged in intellectual fire. It was in the shared silence as we both contemplated a difficult design problem. It was in the way he would pass me a book, our fingers brushing for a fleeting, electric moment. It was in the way his eyes would soften when I grew passionate about a subject. The severe mask of the Duke of Blackwood dissolving to reveal Alistair, a man who saw the world not as a social ladder, but as a series of structures to be understood. One rainy afternoon, as we examined the plans for a bridge, his face grew shadowed. The vibrant energy between us dimmed, replaced by a sudden, heavy grief. He traced the elegant arch of the bridge with a finger that seemed to tremble slightly. "It is a beautiful design," I said softly. "The tension and compression forces are perfectly balanced." "My brother, Edmund, designed a bridge once," he said, his voice so low I had to lean closer to hear it. He did not look at me, but stared at the ink on the page as if it were a ghost. He was younger than me, brighter. He saw the world in lines and angles and soaring possibilities. He was going to be the greatest architect of his generation. The air in the library grew thick with unspoken tragedy. I waited, holding my breath, knowing this was a sacred space I had been invited into. He was impatient. Alistair continued, his voice rough with remembered pain. He used a new engineering principle, one he had developed himself. Everyone told him it was too radical, too untested. I should have stopped him. I should have been more forceful. But he was so brilliant, so certain. He finally looked up, and his eyes were dark pools of a sorrow so profound it made my own small misery seem trivial. The bridge collapsed during the dedication ceremony. He was on it. I wept. Not for myself, but for him. For the brilliant boy who fell from the sky and for the brother who was left behind to carry the weight of it all. I did not offer platitudes or comforting words. The grief was too vast, too raw for such small things. Instead, I reached out and laid my hand over his, on the blueprint. It was a simple, instinctive gesture of shared humanity. His hand was cold, but he did not pull away. He turned his hand over and Bygers curled his fingers around mine, his grip tight, desperate, as if he were holding on to an anchor in a storm. That is why, he said, his voice thick. I cannot abide a dishonest structure. A flaw in a foundation, a miscalculation in a load-bearing wall. It is not an aesthetic failure. It is a moral one. In that moment, I understood everything. His reclusiveness, his severity, his obsession with integrity. It was all a fortress he had built around the gaping wound of his brother's death. And he was letting me inside. We sat there for a long time, our hands clasped together over the drawing of a bridge, the silence in the room filled with the sound of the rain against the tall windows and the quiet, steady beat of two lonely hearts beginning to recognize each other. He had crossed a boundary, not of propriety, but of the soul. He had shown me his flawed foundation, and I had not run. When he finally released my hand, the warmth of his touch lingered on my skin. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a genuine, unguarded smile transform his face. It was like watching the sun break through a lifetime of storm clouds. And I knew, with a terrifying, exhilarating certainty, that I was falling in love with him. Beatrice was no fool. She saw the change in me. She saw the light in my eyes that had not been there before, the quiet confidence in my step. As I left for my meetings at Blackwood House, my happiness was a personal affront to her, a disruption of the natural order she had so carefully curated. The Duke's attention was meant for Rosalind, for the advancement of the family name that was now her own. My involvement was an intolerable complication. She began a subtle campaign of sabotage, making it difficult for me to leave the house, scheduling trivial but unmissable appointments that conflicted with my visits to the Duke. But these were mere skirmishes. I soon discovered she was planning a war. I found out from Rosalind. She came to my room one evening, her face pale with distress. She twisted the sash of her dressing gown in her hands, unable to meet my eyes. "Elara," she began, her voice a troubled whisper. "Mama, she is planning something terrible." A cold dread settled in my stomach. "What is it?" "She has been in correspondence with Lord Brumley," Rosalind said, finally looking at me. Chatter eyes filled with a mixture of fear and guilt. Lord Brumley was a corpulent, lecherous old baron with a reputation for cruelty and a vast dilapidated estate in the north. He was a creature from a nightmare. "She intends to arrange a match for you," Rosalind rushed on, the words tumbling out. "She told him you were eager, that you were a quiet, biddable girl who would suit his needs. She is trying to trap you. Elara, to get you away from London, away from the Duke." The world tilted on its axis. It was one thing to be ignored, to be mocked. It was another entirely to be sold, to be disposed of like unwanted livestock. The air left my lungs in a painful rush. Beatrice would not just clip my wings. She would cage me and hand the key to a monster. But her true masterstroke of cruelty was yet to come. The next morning, a letter arrived for the Duke. I knew this because Beatrice made sure I saw the footman take it. She sealed it with her own wax, a triumphant, malicious smile playing on her lips. I did not know what it contained, but I knew it was poison. My next scheduled meeting with Alistair was that afternoon, and I walked to Blackwood House with a sense of impending doom, every step feeling like a march to the gallows. When the butler showed me into the library, Alistair was not standing by the fire. He was seated behind his enormous desk, his back ramrod straight. The letter lay open before him. The air in the room, usually so calm and welcoming, was charged with a dangerous Arctic cold. He did not rise to greet me. He simply watched me approach, his face an unreadable mask of granite. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and the formal address struck me like a slap. His voice was devoid of all warmth. "I have received a most illuminating letter from your stepmother." My blood ran cold. "Your Grace," I began, my voice a thready whisper, "I do not know what she has told you, but I assure you, pride, she tells me," he interrupted, his voice cutting and precise, "that you are a creature of great ambition and cunning, that you suffer from delusions of grandeur, and that your interest in architecture is a recent and calculated affectation designed to ensnare a wealthy husband. She informs me that you have been promised to Lord Brumley for months, and that your continued association with me is causing your family great distress and dishonor." He paused, his dark eyes boring into me. "She suggests that your mind is unstable, prone to fantasy, Each word was a nail hammered into my coffin. She had not merely tried to sell me, she had tried to erase me, to paint me as a mad, grasping hysteric, to destroy the one pure, honest thing in my life, the connection I had forged with him. The beautiful intellectual sanctuary we had built together was being systematically dismantled by her lies. I felt the floor give way beneath me. The hope that had so tentatively bloomed in my chest withered and died, turning to ash. I could not fight this. Her word, the word of the ambitious and respected Lady Ashworth, against the word of the plain, invisible girl in the corner. There was no contest. I looked at the cold, remote stranger sitting behind the desk, and I saw that I had already lost. Tears welled to my eyes, hot and shameful. I would not let him see me break. I drew myself up, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. "I see," I said, my voice trembling but clear. "Thank you for your time, Your Grace. It has been an education." I turned to leave, to flee back to the shadows where I belonged, my heart shattering into a million pieces with every step. "Stop." The word was not a request. It was a command, sharp and absolute, that halted me in my tracks. I stood with my back to him, unable to turn, unable to move. I heard the scrape of his chair, the sound of his footsteps on the polished floor. He came to stand directly behind me, so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Did you truly believe," he said, his voice now a low, dangerous growl beside my ear, "that I would be swayed by such a clumsy, transparent piece of malice? Did you think my judgment so poor? Did you think I knew you so little?" Slowly I turned to face him. The cold mask was gone. In its place was a blazing, protective fury that took my breath away. His eyes were like burning coals. He took the letter from his desk and with a single deliberate motion tore it in half, then in half again, letting the pieces flutter to the floor like toxic confetti. "This letter is an insult," he said, his voice vibrating with rage. "Not to you. To me, it presumes I am a fool. It presumes I cannot tell the difference between an honest structure and a facade designed to crumble. Your stepmother has made a grave miscalculation." He took a step closer, his anger softening into something else, something fierce and tender that made my heart ache. "Elara, look at me." I lifted my tear-filled eyes to his. "I have spent the last decade of my life in solitude, studying the principles of integrity. In stone, in steel, and in people. I know you," he said, his voice dropping to a raw, intimate whisper. "I know the strength of your mind and the honesty of your spirit. I knew it 3 years ago in a crowded conservatory, and I know it now. She cannot touch that. No one can." He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently brushed a tear from my cheek with his thumb. The simple touch was an inferno. "I am not angry with you, I am angry for you. And I promise you this will end. She will not harm you again." He had not believed her. In the face of her venomous, carefully constructed lies, he had not wavered. He had trusted me. He had trusted himself. The dam of my carefully controlled emotions broke, and I began to sob, not from despair, but from a profound, earth-shattering relief. He did not recoil. He did not offer empty comfort. He simply stood before me, a bastion of unwavering belief, and waited for the storm to pass, his presence a silent promise that I was no longer standing in it alone. The confrontation was set for the following day. Alistair was a man of decisive, swift action. He did not dither or delay. He sent a carriage, not a polite note, to my home with a message that was less an invitation and more a summons. My father, my stepmother, and Rosalind were requested at Blackwood House at 3 o'clock. Beatrice's eyes glittered with triumph. She believed her poison had worked, that this was the meeting where the Duke would formally sever ties with me and reprimand my family for my supposed transgressions. She preened before the mirror, adjusting her silks, preparing for her victory. She instructed me to remain silent. "You have done enough damage with your fantasies, Elara. Let the adults handle this." I said nothing. I simply followed them to the carriage, a strange, calm certainty settling over me. I was walking into the fire, but for the first time I was not afraid of being burned. We were shown into the library. It was a stage, and Alistair was the director. He stood by the hearth, a formidable, unmoving presence. Seated in a chair to the side was a gray-haired, stern-looking man I did not recognize. Alistair's solicitor. Mr. Abernathy, as it turned out. The pieces of Beatrice's torn letter were gone. The room was immaculate, orderly, and lethal. Lord Ashworth, Lady Ashworth, please be seated, Alistair said, his voice glacially calm. He did not invite me to sit. Instead, he gestured to the empty space beside him by the fire, a silent, powerful declaration of allegiance. I moved to stand by his side, feeling his strength as if it were a physical shield. Beatrice began her performance immediately, her voice laden with practiced concern. Your Grace, I cannot express how mortified we are by Elara's behavior. Her fanciful notions have caused us all a great deal of embarrassment. I do hope my letter explained. Your letter, Alistair interrupted, his voice slicing through her syrupy tones, explained a great deal, madam. It explained the depths of your cruelty and the poverty of your character. Beatrice's jaw snapped shut. A flush of angry red crept up her neck. My father shifted uncomfortably in his seat, looking from the Duke to his wife with the terrified eyes of a trapped rabbit. You made several claims in your letter, Alistair continued, his tone conversational, yet deadly. You claimed Miss Ashworth has been promised to Lord Brumley. My solicitor, Mr. Abernathy, has spent the morning in conversation with Lord Brumley's solicitor. It appears the only correspondence has been from you, madam. Lord Brumley was under the impression that the match was merely a vague possibility and that Miss Ashworth's dowry was substantial. Beatrice paled. I was merely opening negotiations. Indeed, Alistair said, his eyes cold. Which brings us to the matter of the dowry. You claimed Miss Ashworth was of modest means. And yet, my investigation into the estate of her late mother, the First Lady Ashworth, reveals something quite different. He nodded to Mr. Abernathy, who opened a leather portfolio and produced a sheaf of documents. According to the will of the late Lady Eleanor Ashworth, the solicitor said in a dry, emotionless voice, her entire personal fortune, including her properties in Kent, were to be held in trust for her daughter, Elara, to be administered by her husband until her marriage. The total value at today's market rate is in excess of £80,000. My father made a choking sound. Rosalind gasped. £80,000. It was a fortune, a life-altering sum of money that I never knew existed. £80,000, Alistair repeated softly, his eyes never leaving Beatrice's face. And yet, for the past 18 years, Miss Ashworth has been dressed in cast-offs and told she is a burden on your finances. The household accounts, which my men also took the liberty of examining, show a rather different story. They show extravagant expenditures on gowns, jewels, and parties. They show funds from the Kent properties being diverted to pay your own considerable debts, Lady Ashworth. Beatrice stared at him, her mask of civility cracking to reveal the raw, desperate greed beneath. Those are lies, forgeries. How dare you pry into our private affairs? I dare, Alistair said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying more weight than a shout. Because you threatened someone I value. You attempted to sell her to a man you knew to be a brute, and you did it to cover your own financial malfeasance. You tried to ruin her reputation with lies about her sanity because her burgeoning happiness was an inconvenience to your social climbing. He took a step forward. You did not count on anyone looking closely. You did not count on anyone seeing her at all. You thought she was invisible, and that is where you failed. Because I see her intelligence, her integrity, her strength, qualities you cannot even begin to comprehend. He stopped before her chair, looking down at the woman who had terrorized me for my entire life. And then he looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. It was my turn. He had built a foundation. Now I had to place the final stone. I found my voice, and it was a voice I did not recognize. It was clear, steady, and utterly devoid of fear. I looked directly at the woman who had called me a creature of dust and shadows. You were wrong, I said, the words falling like chips of ice into the stunned silence. You said I would live a life the color of dishwater. You tried to make it so. You dressed me in gray and hid me in corners and told me I was worthless so often that I started to believe you. You thought my silence was weakness. You were mistaken. It was observation. I took a step toward her, feeling Alistair's presence at my back like a fortress wall. I watched you. I studied you. You are a poorly constructed building, Beatrice. All glittering facade, with nothing of substance behind it. You are all ornamentation and no foundation. And a structure like that, a dishonest structure, cannot stand. It was bound to collapse. I looked at my father, whose face was buried in his hands. And you, Father, you let it happen. You stood by for the sake of a quiet life, and let her hollow out your home, your family, your honor. Finally, I looked at my stepmother, whose face was a ruin of hate and disbelief. You did not make me invisible, I said, the final, freeing truth ringing through the room. You were simply blind. It was over. Beatrice was broken. She stared, speechless, as Mr. Abernathy explained the legal ramifications. The fraud, the embezzlement. She would not go to prison. Alistair was merciful enough to spare the family that public disgrace, but she would be ruined, exiled to a remote cottage in Wales, her name erased from every guest list in London. My father, shamed and broken, finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a lifetime of regret. "Elara," he whispered, "I'm so sorry." I gave a single, slow nod of acknowledgement. It was too little, far too late, but it was something. Rosalind, tears streaming down her face, came to my side. She took my hand, her grip fierce. I am with you, Elara," she whispered, "always." In that moment, the last of the walls between us crumbled. She had finally seen past the gold and the glitter to the rot beneath, and she had chosen her sister. She had chosen truth. After they had gone, a trio of defeated ghosts, departing from the house of their reckoning, Alistair and I stood alone in the library. The air was still, cleansed. The fire crackled, casting a warm, dancing light on the rows of books, on the blueprints still spread across the great table, on his strong, serious face. He came to me, taking both of my hands in his. "It is done," he said softly. "You are free." "You freed me," I whispered, looking up at him, my heart full to bursting. "No," he corrected gently, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. "I simply opened the door. You were the one who had the courage to walk through it." He looked around the vast, beautiful room, his sanctuary, our sanctuary. "This house is very large, Elara. It is filled with books and plans and the ghosts of my past. It is a solid, honest structure, but it is empty. It lacks a heart." He met my gaze, and his own was filled with a raw, breathtaking vulnerability that mirrored the one he had shown me on that rainy afternoon. "I do not wish to rescue you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I have no desire to be your savior. I wish to be your partner. I do not want to give you a home. I want to build one with you, from the foundation up. A place of light and strength and integrity. With you." My breath hitched. My world, which had been so small and gray and cold, was suddenly exploding with color, with light, with impossible, glorious possibility. "Elara Ashworth," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was more profound than any vow. "You are the most honest, brilliant, and beautiful structure I have ever known. Will you marry me?" Tears of joy, pure and unrestrained, spilled down my cheeks. This was not a dream. This was real. This was the man who had seen me when I was invisible, who had valued me when I felt worthless, who had loved my mind before he ever touched my hand. "Yes," I breathed, the word a prayer, a promise, an exultant cry of arrival. "Alistair, yes," he smiled. Then, that rare, magnificent smile that remade his entire face, and he lowered his head and kissed me. It was not a hesitant, tentative kiss. It was a kiss of certainty, of homecoming. It was deep and sure, and tasted of ashes and redemption, the end of a very long winter and the brilliant, breathtaking promise of spring. In his arms I was not a creature of corners and shadows. I was the master architect of my own life, and we were just laying the cornerstone. 1 year later, I stood on the windswept ridge overlooking the Blackwood estate, a crisp autumn wind, whipping strands of hair across my face. In my hands, I held not a fan or a dance card, but a heavy roll of vellum, the edges weighted down with smooth gray stones. Beside me, Alistair, my husband, pointed toward the valley below, where the foundations of a new building were being laid. "If we angle the west wing another 3 degrees to the south," he said, his voice filled with the familiar focused passion I so adored, "the children's solarium will catch the afternoon sun for an additional 40 minutes in the winter." I unrolled the blueprint, the paper crackling in the wind. Our design. The Blackwood Children's Hospital, funded by my reclaimed inheritance and his boundless generosity, designed by both of us in the quiet, firelit evenings in our library. My hand, now confident and sure, made a swift pencil mark on the plans. "You are right, and we can deepen the eaves over the southern windows. It will shade them from the high summer sun, but allow the low winter light to penetrate." He looked at me, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that was now as familiar to me as my own reflection. "Perfect," he murmured, his arms circling my waist, pulling me close against the warmth of his body. We stood there for a long while, in comfortable silence, watching the future rise from the earth below. My father had written a hesitant, remorseful letter, asking for my forgiveness, which I had given freely. Rosalind visited often, her laughter now genuine and light, unburdened by our stepmother's suffocating ambitions. Beatrice remained in Wales, a bitter ghost in a story that had moved on without her. I leaned my head against Alistair's shoulder, breathing in the clean scent of wind and wool. I thought of the girl I had been, the one who lived in the shadows, convinced she was made of dust. It felt like a lifetime ago, a story about someone else. That girl had believed a wager had been made on her future, a cruel bet she was destined to lose. But she had been wrong. The Duke of Blackwood had made a different wager. He had wagered on the quiet girl in the corner. He had bet on her mind, on her integrity, on the strength he saw when no one else was looking. He had bet everything on me, and, in doing so, had given me the courage to bet on myself. I was not a moth, and my life was not the color of dishwater. My life was the color of a blueprint, filled with infinite, beautiful possibilities. A life I was building, beam by beam, stone by stone, with the man who had taught me that the most honest structures are always built on a foundation of love.